Cale Harper had never been to a planet quite like Drakkara. From the moment his shuttle touched down, the sight of the alien landscape filled him with a mix of awe and disbelief. The towering spires of crystalline structures stretched up into a purple sky, their surfaces shimmering as if made from a substance that was both solid and liquid at once. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy that hummed in the background, like the distant sound of a storm waiting to break. He wasn't here as a tourist. Kyle was a human engineer, and he had been brought to Drakkara for one reason only: to untangle two of the most powerful creatures in the galaxy. The Drakkarians, the planet's dominant species, were reptilian in shape, massive, with scaled bodies that shimmered like molten metal. But more impressive than their appearance was their intelligence. They were known across the stars as brilliant architects and engineers. Their ability to manipulate space and time itself made them revered by countless civilizations. However, for all their power, they now had a problem, one that Kyle, the human, was asked to fix. Two of their dragons, Zor-Ithar and Naluun, had become trapped in an ancient network of energy that connected the core of their planet to the very fabric of the universe. The dragons had been caught in a tangle of dimensional forces that, if not undone, could rip apart the delicate balance of the galaxy. The Drakkarians, despite their intelligence, had failed to free them. They needed Cale, a human, to do what they could not. Cale, who had been trained in engineering and complex systems back on Earth, didn't hesitate. He had solved problems before, though nothing quite like this. His hands shook slightly as he stepped out of the shuttle, adjusting to the gravity of this alien world. He was about to face challenges beyond anything he had ever encountered, but as he looked at the massive forms of Zor-Ithar and Naluun hovering in a strange stasis, a part of him felt ready. They were magnificent, enormous creatures, their eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. A Drakkarian elder, towering over Cale by a full meter, stepped forward. The being's skin shimmered with a silvery sheen, and its eyes, deep and calculating, studied Cale carefully. "You are the one who can save them?" the elder asked in a voice like a low rumble. Despite the size and power of the Drakkarian, Cale sensed the deep respect in the question. "I hope so," Cale said, his voice steady, though inside he felt a knot tightening in his stomach. "I'll need to see the dragons and the energy network before I make any promises." The elder nodded and motioned for Cale to follow. They moved swiftly through the crystalline city, passing structures that seemed to pulse with energy, like veins of light running through the ground. The air smelled strange here, sweet and metallic, like the scent of a storm after a long drought. Cale's boots clicked softly on the smooth floor as they made their way to the central chamber. Inside the vast hall, Cale saw the dragons for the first time up close. Zor-Ithar and Naluun floated in mid-air, their massive bodies suspended by the same energy that had bound them. They were enormous, each one large enough to fill the hall 10 times over. Their scales a beautiful combination of gold and deep green. Their eyes were the most unsettling thing of all. They were ancient and wise, filled with knowledge that no human could comprehend. Yet, for all their power, they appeared trapped, their movements sluggish as though they were caught in a web of invisible threads. "Can you fix this?" the elder asked again, his voice more urgent now. Cale approached cautiously, studying the shimmering energy that held the dragons in place. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The energy was chaotic, constantly shifting as though it were alive. He could feel the force of it tugging at his very being, as if trying to pull him into its grasp. But Cale had faced worse. This was just another puzzle to solve. "I think so," Cale said, his mind already working. "But I'll need more information. This isn't just a mechanical problem. There's something here that's alive. It's almost as if the dragons are part of the energy itself." The elder seemed to hesitate, but then, with a sharp motion, he gestured to a panel on the wall. The information you seek is here. The dragon's history, their connection to the energy grid. Kyle studied the panel closely. It was covered in strange symbols, but his training had taught him how to read complex data systems, even those that were alien. He ran his fingers over the panel, and the symbols began to shift, revealing a series of images and diagrams. Kyle's eyes widened as he processed what he was seeing. The dragons weren't just creatures. They were ancient guardians, tied to the very structure of the universe itself. Their wings were not just wings. They were conduits for dimensional energy, channels that allowed the Dracarians to manipulate the fabric of space and time. The energy that held them was not a simple trap. It was part of an ancient system, one that had been built long before the Dracarians had even discovered their planet. The dragons were the key to maintaining balance in the universe, and their entanglement had caused a disruption. If Kale didn't untangle them soon, the consequences would be catastrophic. Zorithar and Naloon were never meant to be separated. Kyle muttered to himself. They're part of a larger system. If I release one without the other, it could destabilize everything. The elder nodded gravely. We know. That is why we called you. You are the one who can see the solution we cannot. We have tried and failed, but you are different. Kale wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or overwhelmed by the pressure. He had never worked with such powerful creatures before, and the thought of tampering with something as delicate as the fabric of reality made his stomach churn. But this was what he had trained for, to solve the impossible. And this was his chance to prove that humanity had more to offer than just brute strength or military might. Humans could think in ways others couldn't, and Kale intended to use that to his advantage. I'll need tools. Equipment, Kale said, turning to face the elder. And I'll need you to trust me. If we're going to untangle the dragons, it's not going to be easy. The elder's eyes softened. You have our trust, Humyn. Do what you must. Kale's mind was already racing through the possibilities. He had never faced anything like this, but he knew how to approach challenges with a clear head. The dragons needed to be freed from the energy grid, but in doing so, he might have to rewire the very laws of space itself. The balance of the universe depended on what happened next. As Kale turned back to the dragons, the weight of the situation sank in. He wasn't just saving two creatures, he was saving a galaxy. And the only way to do that was to think like no one else could. With a deep breath, Kyle rolled up his sleeves and set to work. The dragon's tangled threads were calling to him, and he was ready to answer. Kyle Harper stood at the edge of the vast chamber, his eyes fixed on the two dragons, Zorithar and Naloon. They floated motionless in the center of the room, their massive bodies suspended in the tangled web of energy that held them. The air around them shimmered with power, and Kale could feel the hum of the dimensional forces thrumming in the air. It was as if the entire room was alive with electricity, and the dragons themselves were both part of the energy and trapped within it. Kale's mind raced. He had studied the diagrams and ancient texts the Dracarians had given him, trying to understand the energy grid that kept the dragons bound. The diagrams were complex, filled with symbols and equations that were difficult to comprehend. But Kyle had always been good at puzzles, and this was no different. The more he looked at the energy grid, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a trap. It was a living, breathing system. And Zorithar and Naloon were the key to keeping it all together. He approached one of the dragons cautiously. Zorithar was the larger of the two, its scales a brilliant shade of gold, reflecting the strange lights of the room. Its eyes glowed faintly, and Kale could see the wisdom and ancient power within them. The dragon's wings, vast and leathery, were folded tightly against its body, as if trapped in an eternal stillness. Despite its size and majesty, Zorithar seemed completely vulnerable, its immense power held captive by the very energy it had once helped control. "All right, let's see what we're working with," Kyle muttered to himself. His voice echoed through the room, but there was no response from the dragons. They seemed oblivious to him, locked in their dimensional prison. Kyle adjusted his gloves and picked up the small device he had built earlier, a tool designed to interface with the energy grid. It was simple, yet effective. A series of circuits and a small energy converter were all he needed to begin his work. As Kale approached the first energy node, he could feel the tension in the air. The energy was unstable here, pulsing and shifting in unpredictable ways. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and the entire system could collapse. Kale took a deep breath, focused his mind, and began to work. He connected the device to the energy node, feeling the surge of power as it activated. For a moment, everything seemed to hum in perfect harmony. But then, with a sudden jolt, the energy around him flared up, and Kyle had to step back to avoid being thrown off balance. "Easy now," Kale said, his voice calm. He adjusted the settings on his device and tried again, this time more carefully. The energy crackled, but Kyle could feel himself making progress. He was unraveling the threads of the energy web, slowly but surely. But he knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much to do. As he worked, he could feel the dragon's eyes on him. Zorithar's gaze was intense, studying him with a depth that Kale couldn't quite comprehend. It was as if the dragon was trying to understand who he was, why a human had come to free it from its prison. Kale had always been good with machines, but he had never faced something like this before. These were creatures of legend, beings that existed on a scale far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. And yet, Kale was the one who had been called to help them. The tension in the room grew as Kyle continued to work. He could feel the dragon's frustration, even though they were silent. It was clear they didn't want to be trapped like this any longer, but they weren't going to make it easy on him. The energy grid was resisting him, almost as if it had a mind of its own. Every time Kale made progress, the energy would shift, forcing him to start over. It was like trying to untangle a knot that kept retying itself. After hours of frustrating work, Kale finally took a step back and wiped the sweat from his brow. The dragons were still motionless, and the energy grid had not loosened as much as he'd hoped. He had made progress, but it wasn't enough. He needed more time, and more information. Kale's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind him. The Dracarian elder, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "You are making progress, but it is slow," the elder said, his voice filled with both respect and concern. "You cannot do this alone. You must understand their connection to the grid." Kyle nodded, understanding what the elder was implying. He had assumed that his technical expertise would be enough, but the Dracarians were right. This was more than just a mechanical problem. It was a matter of understanding the very nature of the dragons and their place in the universe. If Kale could unlock that, he would have the key to freeing them. The elder gestured toward the dragons. Zorithar and Naluan are more than just creatures of power. They are the guardians of the balance. Their connection to the energy grid is what keeps the fabric of the universe stable. If you release them without understanding this, it could destroy everything. Kyle looked up at the elder, his mind racing. "I understand, but how do I understand their connection? What am I missing?" The elder's gaze softened, and he moved closer to Kyle. "You are human," he said, "and you see the world in ways we cannot. Your mind is not bound by the same rules as ours. You think in terms of machines, in terms of logic. But the dragons think in terms of energy, of life itself. They are not just part of the system, they are the system." Kyle frowned. "So, I need to think like them?" The elder nodded. "Exactly. The dragons are bound to the energy, yes, but they are also part of it. They are living embodiments of the forces that shape the universe. To understand them, you must not only unravel the energy grid, you must communicate with them. Kale's eyes widened in realization. He had been so focused on the technical aspects of the problem that he hadn't considered the dragon's perspective. He had been treating them as if they were just another set of mechanical problems to solve, but they were far more than that. They were ancient beings with knowledge and power beyond anything he could imagine. Kyle turned back to the dragons, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. If he didn't succeed, the universe itself could unravel. He needed to communicate with the dragons, not just as machines, but as living, breathing creatures. But how? How could he reach them? With a deep breath, Kale closed his eyes and focused. He let go of his technical thoughts and opened his mind to the energy around him. He reached out, not with his hands, but with his senses, trying to connect with the dragons on a deeper level. At first, there was nothing. But then, slowly, he began to feel a faint pulse of energy, like a heartbeat. It was faint at first, but then it grew stronger, more distinct. Kale could feel it. Zoriathar and Nalun were trying to communicate with him. They were not just creatures trapped in an energy field. They were conscious, aware. Their minds were vast, filled with ancient knowledge, and Kale could feel their frustration. They wanted to be free, but they couldn't break the bonds on their own. Kale concentrated harder, pushing past the noise in his mind. He felt the dragon's thoughts, their presence, and slowly, he began to understand. They were not asking for freedom, they were asking for a guide. They needed someone who could help them navigate the tangled web of energy, someone who could see the pattern they could not. They needed him. With a new sense of determination, Kyle opened his eyes. The energy grid was still there, still tangled and chaotic, but now he understood it. He knew what needed to be done. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. The dragons weren't just waiting to be freed, they were waiting for Kale to unlock the system, to help them regain their place in the cosmic order. Kale nodded to himself. This was no longer just about engineering, it was about understanding. And now, he was ready. Kale sat in front of the two dragons, Zoriathar and Nalun, his mind a whirl of thoughts and calculations. The energy grid that bound them was complicated, and now he understood it better. But understanding wasn't enough. To free them, he had to unravel the web of energy that held them in place, a task far more difficult than Kale had ever imagined. Yet, he was determined. He had learned to think like the dragons, to feel their presence, and now he had to act. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the energy fields around the dragons. Kyle stood up slowly, his gaze flicking between Zoriathar and Nalun. They were ancient beings, and they had been part of the universe's cosmic order for longer than anyone could understand. Their connection to the fabric of reality was something Kale had only begun to grasp, and freeing them would require more than just his engineering skills. It would require understanding their place in the universe, the role they played in maintaining balance. Kyle felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized the true weight of what he was doing. If he failed, not only would the dragons remain trapped, but the entire balance of the universe could collapse. The energy that flowed through them was essential to the stability of the cosmos. He wasn't just saving two creatures, he was saving the very structure of existence. He took a deep breath and focused on the energy grid once more. The device he had built was working, but there was something more he needed to understand. The connections between the dragons and the energy system were like threads, woven into the very fabric of reality. Each thread was delicate, fragile. If Kale pulled too hard, it could snap, sending a shockwave through the universe. As he worked, Kale could feel the pressure building. The grid was resisting, pushing back against him with every move he made. The energy surged, then flickered, then surged again. Kale's heart raced as he adjusted the settings on his device, trying to find a way to stabilize the energy. The dragons remained motionless, their eyes glowing faintly. Kale had learned to interpret the slight shifts in their gaze, the way they watched him with both patience and urgency. They wanted to be freed, but they also feared what might happen if they were. They could sense the danger of the energy grid unraveling, just as Kale could. For hours, Kale worked tirelessly, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. He was sweating now, his hands shaking from the strain, but he couldn't stop. The dragons were depending on him. The universe was depending on him. He couldn't afford to fail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kyle found a breakthrough. One of the threads in the energy grid, the one that connected Zorithar to the rest of the system, had loosened slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He had to act quickly before the thread tightened again. He adjusted the device in his hands, carefully tuning the energy output. The room crackled with power as the grid responded. For a moment, it felt as if the entire chamber was shaking. Kale held his breath, his fingers moving with precision as he connected the device to the loose thread. Slowly, carefully, he began to pull. The energy around Zorithar pulsed, then snapped. There was a bright flash of light, and for a brief moment, the dragon's body shimmered like a living constellation. Kyle gasped as the dragon's massive form wavered, its wings flickering open and closed as if testing its freedom. The energy was weakening, loosening its grip. Zorithar's eyes locked with Kyle's. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that told Kyle the dragon understood what he was doing. There was no word, no sound, just a silent connection that passed between them. Zorithar had been waiting for Kyle to reach this point. The dragon had trusted him, and now that trust was beginning to pay off. But just as Kale thought he had succeeded, the energy grid surged once more. The thread that Kale had loosened snapped back into place with a force that knocked him off his feet. His device went flying from his hands, and he struggled to stay upright as the room trembled. The energy flared violently, and the dragons once again became motionless. "No, no!" Kyle muttered to himself, scrambling to retrieve the device. The surge had pushed him back, but he couldn't let this stop him. He had to try again. He had to finish what he had started. Kyle regained his composure and activated the device once more. This time, he had to be even more careful. The energy grid was alive, changing with every movement he made. It was as if the grid itself was aware of his presence, trying to stop him from disrupting it. He tried a different approach. Instead of pulling at the threads of energy directly, he began to push them. Gently, at first, then with more force as he began to understand the way the grid worked. The threads didn't just need to be loosened, they needed to be restructured, redirected. He had to rewrite the code of reality itself. The dragon's eyes flickered again, and Kale felt the pressure on him ease. It was as if they were working with him, guiding him. He could feel their energy, not as something foreign, but as something familiar. It was like the energy and Kale were becoming one, like he was part of the system, and the system was part of him. The grid responded to his movements, shifting and realigning. The tension in the room began to ease, and Kale knew he was getting closer. But just as he thought he was making real progress, he was hit with a new wave of resistance. It was stronger than before, and Kale realized with a sinking feeling that the grid was not just resisting him, it was fighting back. The dragons were trying to communicate with him again, but their messages were faint, unclear. Kyle closed his eyes, focusing on their energy, trying to understand what they were saying. It was like trying to listen to a distant whisper through a storm, but Kale pressed on, tuning his senses to the dragon's wavelength, and then, like a bolt of lightning, it hit him. The grid wasn't just a barrier, it was a test. The dragons had to be freed in a specific way, a way that respected the balance they maintained. Kale wasn't just untangling threads. He was realigning the very foundation of space itself. He had to make sure that the energy flowed smoothly, that the threads were not just cut, but redirected, woven into a new pattern. Kyle adjusted his device once more, his hands moving with newfound certainty. The energy began to settle, and the dragon's forms flickered once again. Zorithar and Nalun seemed to respond, their wings unfolding slightly as if testing the space around them. This time, Kyle was careful. The grid was no longer a force that resisted him. It was an ally. Kale could feel the energy flowing through him now, and he knew exactly how to guide it. Slowly, piece by piece, the energy grid began to unravel, and the dragon's connection to the energy system was loosened. The room's hum grew quieter, the light dimmed, and for the first time since Kale had arrived, the dragons appeared to be at rest. Kale exhaled, his heart racing. He had done it. Zorithar and Nalun were free. But there was no time to relax. The work wasn't over yet. He still had to make sure the entire system remained stable. The dragons had been freed, but now he had to keep the balance intact. The energy in the room was still swirling, but Kale could feel it settling into place. The dragons were no longer trapped. They were free. Kale wiped his brow, breathing heavily. Now, we wait. The chamber was eerily silent. Kyle stood in front of Zorithar and Nalun, his mind racing as he looked at the two dragons. They were free now, or at least they seemed to be. The energy grid that had held them captive was slowly settling into place, and the tension in the room had lessened. But Kale wasn't sure if the job was truly done. Something about the situation still didn't sit right with him. The dragon's massive forms floated above the ground, their wings twitching as if testing the air. Their eyes, once fierce and powerful, now held an odd calmness. They were no longer trapped, but Kyle knew that the real test had just begun. The balance of the universe, the energy grid, and the dragon's connection to it were fragile. One wrong move, and everything could collapse. Kyle took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair. He had done the hard part. He had unwound the grid, loosened the threads of energy that had entangled the dragons. But the system wasn't perfect. The energy that had once flowed through the dragons was still shifting, still unstable. There was something Kale had missed, a small detail, perhaps, or a force he hadn't accounted for. He had been so focused on freeing the dragons that he hadn't fully considered what it meant for the universe itself. The Dracarian elder, who had been silently watching from the corner of the room, stepped forward. His silvery scales gleamed in the dim light of the chamber, and his eyes were filled with concern. "You have done what no one else could do," the elder said, his voice low and reverberating with ancient wisdom. "You have freed them, Kyle Harper. But there is still one question you must answer." Kyle turned toward the elder, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I've completed the task. The dragons are free. The grid is stable." The elder shook his head slowly. "It is not that simple. Yes, the dragons are free, but they are no longer connected to the energy grid in the way they once were. The grid has changed, and so have they. It is possible that this change will lead to greater power for the dragons, but also greater instability. The energy that once flowed through them was a force of balance, a force that kept the universe in harmony. Without it, there may be consequences." Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He had known there would be risks, but he hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of them. If the dragons were no longer part of the energy grid, what would happen to the universe? The very system that had held everything in place could be thrown into chaos. "You're saying that by freeing them, I may have caused a disaster?" Kyle asked, his voice tight with concern. The elder didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the dragons, who were now slowly descending to the ground. Zorithar's golden scales shimmered in the dim light, and Naluun's deep green form rippled with an energy that Kyle could feel even from across the room. They were powerful, but there was something different about them now. Their connection to the energy grid had been severed, and it seemed as if they were still adjusting to their newfound freedom. "There is no way to know for sure," the elder said. "The balance of the universe is delicate, and the dragons were once its guardians. They were part of a larger system, and that system has been disrupted. Only time will tell what will happen next." Kyle felt a weight settle in his chest. He had done what no one else could. He had freed the dragons. But now he wasn't sure if he had made a terrible mistake. The thought of the entire universe falling apart because of one decision was almost too much to bear. As Kale pondered the elder's words, he noticed a subtle change in the dragons. Zorithar, the larger of the two, turned his head toward Kyle, his glowing eyes meeting the engineer's. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the weight of that gaze. It was as if Zorithar was trying to communicate something Kale couldn't quite grasp. And then, Naluun's eyes shifted toward him as well, their deep green depths seeming to shimmer with ancient knowledge. Kyle didn't know what to do. He had freed them, yes, but now he wasn't sure if that was the right thing. If the dragons were no longer part of the system, could they still protect the balance of the universe? And if they couldn't, what would happen to everything the dragons had guarded for eons? The tension in the room was thick. The energy was unstable, and the dragons were now more powerful than ever, but they were also more unpredictable. Kale could feel the weight of their power pressing down on him. They were no longer tied to the grid, and that meant they could do whatever they wanted. But would they? The elder's voice broke through Kale's thoughts. "The dragons are ancient beings," the elder said softly. "They have seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. They have seen the birth and death of stars. But they are not gods. They are guardians, protectors of the balance. It is you, Kale Harper, who must decide what happens next. You have freed them, but now you must guide them." Kyle turned to the elder, his mind racing. He had done the impossible, but now the consequences of his actions were clearer than ever. The dragons were free, but they were no longer part of the system that had kept the universe in balance. It was up to him to help them find their place in a world that had changed. He swallowed hard. The decision was his. He could let the dragons go and see what happened, trusting that they would find their way. Or he could try to rebind them to the grid, to restore the balance they had once protected. But that would mean giving up their newfound freedom, something Kale knew the dragons would not take lightly. As Kale wrestled with this decision, he felt a strange sense of connection to the dragons. They had trusted him to free them, and now they were looking to him for guidance. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was a key player in the fate of the universe. The pressure was immense, and Kyle knew there was no easy choice. Zorithar moved first. The massive dragon's wings unfurled with a soft, thunderous sound, and he took a slow step forward, his glowing eyes never leaving Kyle's. There was no aggression in his gaze, only a deep, ancient understanding. Zorithar's presence was overwhelming, but Kyle stood his ground, feeling the weight of the dragon's silent request. Naluun, too, moved closer, her body rippling with energy. The two dragons stood before Kyle, waiting for him to make his decision. He could sense that they were ready to move forward, but they needed him to lead them. Their power was immense, but it was unanchored, like a ship without a rudder. They needed something, someone, to guide them back into the balance they had once maintained. Kyle closed his eyes for a moment, letting the enormity of the situation wash over him. His mind flashed back to Earth, to the simple problems he used to solve as a child, and then to the great challenges he had faced on Drakara. He had always believed that humanity's strength lay in its ability to adapt, to find new solutions when old ones failed. And now, he had to do just that. "All right," Kale said, his voice steady despite the weight of the decision. We'll find a new balance. Together. The elder nodded in approval. And Kale felt a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't just an outsider here anymore. He was a part of this new order. He had freed the dragons, and now he would help them understand their place in a universe that had changed. Kyle took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The dragons, Zorithar and Naluun, followed him, their eyes filled with silent promise. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Kale had made his choice, and now he would see it through. The sky above Drakkara was painted in streaks of orange and purple as the first rays of dawn crept across the horizon. Kale stood on the edge of the platform, watching the sky slowly light up. The dragons, Zorithar and Naluun, stood behind him, their massive forms casting long shadows over the crystalline city below. The air was still and heavy with anticipation. Kale could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet before the storm. He had made his choice. He had freed the dragons, and now he had to help them understand their new place in a universe that had shifted under their feet. They were no longer part of the ancient energy grid, no longer bound by the same rules. They were powerful, yes, but they were also unpredictable. The balance of the cosmos depended on what came next. The elder had stepped back, trusting Kale to guide the dragons. The fate of the universe was in his hands, and Kale knew that every decision he made from here on would have far-reaching consequences. Zorithar, the larger of the two dragons, stepped forward, his golden scales gleaming in the light. His wings, now unfurled, caught the wind, sending ripples of energy through the air. He looked down at Kale, his eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. For a moment, Kale felt as if the dragon could see into his very soul, reading his thoughts, his doubts, his fears. "We are free, Kale Harper," Zorithar said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "But freedom is a burden. What is our purpose now, without the energy that once bound us?" Kale took a deep breath, turning to face the dragon. He had expected the question, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. The weight of the responsibility rested heavily on his shoulders. The dragons had been guardians of balance for eons. Now, without the energy grid, they had to find a new purpose. But where could they fit in this new order? "I don't have all the answers," Kyle said, his voice steady. "But I know this. You're not alone. The universe has changed, and so have you. You're free now to choose your path, to create a new balance, and I'll be with you, helping you find that balance." Naluun, the smaller dragon, stirred beside Zorithar, her green scales shifting in the light. Her wings fluttered with a slight breeze, and her eyes locked onto Kyle. "The grid was our guide," Naluun said softly. "Without it, we are lost." Kyle nodded. "I understand, but the grid wasn't perfect. It had flaws, and it bound you in ways you didn't deserve. Now, you have the chance to choose a new path, one that will not be dictated by the energy grid. You can create your own destiny. But that means you need to trust yourselves, and trust me." Zorithar's massive head lowered, his glowing eyes narrowing in thought. The air around him rippled with energy, and Kale could feel the power radiating from the dragon. But there was something else there, something he hadn't felt before: uncertainty. The dragons had always been the ones in control, the ones who shaped the balance. Now, they were as uncertain as Kale, unsure of what came next. "You speak of trust," Zorithar said. "But can we trust ourselves? We have known our place for so long. We were created for a purpose. To lose that purpose, it is as if we are adrift in an endless void." Kyle felt a pang of sympathy for the dragons. They had been guardians for so long, their purpose written into the very fabric of the universe. To lose that purpose was to lose part of their identity. And Kale knew that finding a new purpose, a new role, would be difficult, But he also knew that the dragons were not alone anymore. They had him, and they had each other. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," Kale said, stepping closer to Zorithar. "We can take it one step at a time. The universe is vast, and there are new paths to explore. I'll help you find them, just as you helped me understand this world. You're not adrift. You're free to choose your future." The words seemed to resonate with Zorithar. The great dragon raised his head, his eyes narrowing with determination. "You are right, Kale Harper. We are not alone. We have a future, and it is ours to shape." A sense of calm washed over the room as Zorithar and Nalun stood side by side, their massive forms radiating power and strength. The uncertainty that had clouded their presence seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet understanding. They were free, but freedom was not a curse. It was a gift, one that they could use to create a new future for themselves and for the universe. Kyle smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had done it. He had freed the dragons, but more importantly, he had helped them find their place in a changing universe, and now, together, they would move forward. "We'll start small," Kyle said, his voice confident. "There's still so much we need to learn. We can begin by helping the Drakarians, the ones who brought me here. They've lost their connection to the grid, too. Maybe we can help them rebuild, find a new way to live without the old energy." Zorithar nodded, his massive head tilting slightly. "We will help the Drakarians," he said, "and perhaps in helping them, we will find our own way." Kale turned to face the elder who had been quietly watching from the doorway. The Drakarian nodded approvingly, his eyes filled with respect. "You have done what we could not, Kyle Harper," the elder said. "You have freed the dragons, and you have shown them a new path. The universe owes you a debt." Kyle shook his head, his expression humble. "I didn't do it alone. The dragons are powerful, but they needed someone to help guide them, just like I needed help from them to understand this world. We're all part of something bigger." The elder smiled, and Kale could see the pride in his eyes. "You are wise beyond your years, Humyn, and you have proven that even the smallest of us can change the course of destiny." The sky above Drakara continued to brighten as the sun crested the horizon, casting a warm glow across the city. The air felt different now, lighter, more open, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath. The dragons, no longer bound by the old grid, stood tall, ready to embrace the future. And Kale, the human engineer who had dared to do the impossible, stood beside them, knowing that the adventure was far from over. But for the first time since his arrival, Kale felt at peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had freed the dragons, helped them find their new place in the universe, and in doing so, had proven that even the greatest of challenges could be overcome with trust, determination, and a little bit of human ingenuity. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light across the world, Kale smiled. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. Humanity had a place in the stars, and with the dragons by his side, there was nothing they couldn't face.